Hey Pokemon fans, I'm Jay Witz, and today we have a very special episode. This is going to be my channel's first special guest episode, and today we have Tamashii Hiroka, who's been making these kinds of videos for years longer than I have, and she's going to do today's fact of the day. So, guess you don't need me.
As with most game series that originate in Japan, sometimes not every title gets an international release. In some cases, it's just one or two games that eventually get a re-release later, or in worse cases, it's entire chunks of a series, resulting in confusing numbering or even numbers completely missing. Pokemon has been pretty lucky so far to have most of its titles localized for an international release, but there are still some titles that have slipped through the cracks and have never made it worldwide. Today we're going to take a look at some of those titles and why we never got to play them. It's pretty common knowledge that outside of Japan, the first Pokemon games we got were Pokemon Red and Blue, but that in Japan the first ones they got were Red and Green. You'd think that would mean it was their green version we didn't get, but actually it was their blue. Let me explain. The first games to come out in Japan were Red and Green, and then later Blue version came out with improved graphics and some other changes like the layout of the Unknown Dungeon. When Pokemon was released here, both our Red and our Blue were created using their Blue version as a base, keeping the updated graphics and other changes. However, the Pokemon locations were based on Pokemon Red and Green, so essentially what we got were entirely different versions than anything that was released in Japan. Their Red and Green have the same Pokemon locations as our Red and Blue, but they have more primitive graphics and some bugs and glitches that were fixed by the time Blue was released. Meanwhile, their Blue version has unique Pokemon locations compared to the Japanese Red and Green, and the American Red and Blue, so it should be counted as an entirely separate version. This means if you're going to count every single unique version in Generation 1, you'd have Japan's Red, Green, and Blue, as well as our Red and Blue, and to top it off there's also Yellow version, which was more or less the same in both Japan and America. The handheld games aren't the only first-gen Pokemon games with a confusing history. There is also a version of Pokemon Stadium that we never got. Its name is just Pokemon Stadium, but it's not the Pokemon Stadium that we know and love. This version features only 42 Pokemon as opposed to all 151, and was intended to simulate the finals of tournaments held in Japan, so that players could participate if they weren't able to in real life, by challenging the finalists with their own Pokemon. Players were a bit pissed that not all 151 Pokemon were available though, as Nintendo originally had no plans to release a full version. To appease the fans though, a 64DD expansion disc was announced shortly after. What the hell is a 64DD, you ask? Well, that's another piece of video game history that never saw a Western release. It was an add-on for the N64 that could essentially add content to games you already own, like carts loaded with DLC. However, it was a commercial failure in Japan, partially due to being released at the end of the N64's lifespan. Nintendo was left for little choice but to release a full version of the game for the regular Nintendo 64, which in Japan was called Pokemon Stadium 2, but was released here as Pokemon Stadium 1. You see, by the time Pokemon games were being released here, we were quite a bit behind Japan. Their Stadium 1 was released in 1998, almost 2 years before we ever got a Pokemon N64 game. Nintendo of America saw the two Japanese Stadium games and decided rather than marketing both the unfinished version and the completed second version, they would just release the second one here and skip the first. Their Stadium 2 is the Stadium 1 we all know and love, with all of our favorite playable Pokemon, as well as the awesome minigames and extra features. As you can imagine, when the Gen 2 Stadium came out, in Japan it was called Pokemon Stadium Gold and Silver, and here it was just called Stadium 2. Speaking of the 64DD, did you know that there were other Pokemon expansions planned for it that were never released at all? Footage has been found at Pokemon Snap back when it was originally supposed to be a 64DD game. They also announced a Pokemon RPG for the 64DD, but no footage or images have ever materialized of it. Believe it or not, there is actually an official SNES game featuring Pokemon characters. In 1999, using the now-defunct Nintendo Power Service, players could take blank Super Famicom memory cassettes to Lawson stores and download games from floppy machines for cheaper than their retail cost. They also included some games exclusive to the service, like Picross MP Volume 1, which is the first in a series of 8 Nintendo-themed Picross games. Picross is essentially a nonogram, or paint-by-numbers puzzle, which made popular puzzle games in Japan. This particular Picross game included puzzles featuring tons of Nintendo characters, not only from Pokemon but from Yoshi's Story, Kirby, Star Fox 64, Ocarina of Time, Super Mario 64, Wario Land 2, and Donkey Kong Country. In the character round, players could fill in 12 puzzles based on different Pokemon from the first two generations. So far, we've mostly talked about versions of games that did make an international release, but there are actually some Pokemon games that didn't get localized at all. While the West was graced with the first Pokemon trading card game, Game Boy game, we were denied the sequel. Pokemon Card GB2, Here Comes Team GR. It was very similar to the first game, but it adds a ton of new features, like new cards, a larger in-game world, a plot, and the ability to play as a female character. It even had an enemy team, Team Great Rocket, which kidnapped club masters in an attempt to steal legendary cards. It's up to the protagonist, either Mark or Mint, to defeat their leader King Bururichi, to rescue the club leaders and restore peace to TCG Island. The game was previewed by IGN in 2001, and though they predicted a US release, none ever materialized. Perhaps Nintendo of America thought the game didn't improve upon the original enough, only including one more expansion than the previous game, and didn't feel like customers would want to spend money on it. Perhaps the game was just too text-heavy, and translating it would have pulled resources from other games that were coming out at the time, like Pokemon Gold, Silver, and Crystal. Whatever the reason, Card GB2 never got released worldwide, and to this day it remains one of the only Pokemon games that only Japan will ever get to play. Since this is Poke Fact of the Day, here's something you may not have known before. Pokemon had its very own handheld console once, the Pokemon Mini. It is the smallest cartridge-based system ever released by Nintendo. It was released in 2001 in North America, exclusively to play Pokemon minigames on, but only 4 out of its 10 Japanese titles were ever released here. We got Pokemon Party Mini, Pokemon Zany Cards, Pokemon Pinball Mini, and Pokemon Puzzle Collection, but not Pokemon Tetris, Pokemon Breeder Mini, Pokemon Puzzle Collection Volume 2, Pokemon Race Mini, Pichu Bros Mini, or Togepi's Great Adventure. Interestingly, Pokemon Tetris was released in Europe as well, but never America. I guess the system never sold well enough in America to warrant releases of its other games, as the only 4 we ever got were launch titles. The games themselves are basic and there isn't a lot to say about them. Pokemon Tetris is exactly what it sounds like. Pokemon Breeder Mini is a Tamagotchi-like game where you take care of a baby Pokemon. Puzzle Collection Volume 2 has 80 different little puzzles to solve. Race Mini is a very primitive Pokemon Dash, Pichu Bros Mini is another collection of minigames, and Togepi's Great Adventure has you guiding Togepi out of a tower, avoiding traps along the way. One game was barely released at all, and it's no longer available anywhere in the world. The Pokepark Fishing Rally DS game was a DS Download Play demo, available only via DS Download Play in Japan, and disappeared after the DS system was shut down. The game also had a 12-hour time limit, so even if you didn't shut your system off, you couldn't play it for more than 12 hours. To download it, one had to either go to the Pokepark, which is a Pokemon theme park that existed in Japan in 2005 for a short time, a Pokemon Festa, which is basically a Japanese-only convention for Pokemon fans, or a Pokemon Center, which are Pokemon retail stores in Japan. So with all the exclusivity, what could you do in this game? Catch fish? Yep. Much like fishing in Animal Crossing, you just wait till the bulb got pulled under, and then tap the A button repeatedly until the fish Pokemon was caught. Players could catch only 5 Pokemon per game, and were scored on the size, level, and rarity of that Pokemon. The download stations held high scores, and if your score is in the top 50, you could upload your score to the station for everyone to see. There was even a Japan-only Pokemon arcade game. Released in 2007, Pokemon Bat Trio featured gameplay similar to Pokemon Stadium or Battle Revolution, except featuring only triple battles, hence the name Bat Trio. It was aimed at the younger Pokemon audience, and thus the battling system was dumbed down quite a bit from the complex mechanics found in normal Pokemon games, and it relied on a mechanic involving special pucks that affected which Pokemon could be used. In 2012, Pokemon Bat Trio games were removed from Japanese arcades, and replaced with Pokemon Treta games, which were the sequel to Bat Trio. Treta also features triple battles only, but instead of using the pucks from the first game, players have to search for and capture the Pokemon they get to battle with. Treta machines are still in Japanese arcades today, so if you want to play one, you'll have to plan a trip there. With the popularization of home consoles, arcades lost popularity outside of Asia for the most part. You don't see people lining up with quarters in their pockets anymore now that you can play better games from the comfort of your own home, and that's probably why we'll never see Bat Trio nor Treta here in the States. In 2009, 3 Pokemon WiiWare titles were released in Japan as part of the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon series. Keep Going, Blazing Adventure Squad, Let's Go, Stormy Adventure Squad, and Go For It, Light Adventure Squad. Each title cost 1,200 Wii points, and featured version-exclusive Pokemon but similar gameplay. They were a lot less plot-heavy than previous Mystery Dungeon games, and had save files that could work between each version, so you could get Pokemon from all 3 on your team. Why these haven't been in the international WiiWare store I don't know, but I can only guess that WiiWare games just aren't a big enough draw to expend resources translating. These games in particular scored very low in Japanese reviews, and Nintendo probably figured American players wouldn't give them the benefit of the doubt. Learn with Pokemon Typing Adventure is a recent game and a bit of an oddity. It was released in Japan in 2011, Europe in 2012, and Australia in 2013, but never in America in spite of the game being successfully translated to English for the European and Australian releases. This game is exactly what it sounds like. You go around using a Bluetooth-enabled detachable keyboard to learn to type with various Pokemon. The main purpose of the game is to teach children to type, but it can also be enjoyed by older players, as some levels can get very difficult. I would say something fishy is going on with this game not being released stateside, but as the Australian version just came out January 10th of this year, I'd give it a bit more time before giving up on it for good. I'm not too broken up about it either way, because I've paid my dues and I've played my typing games in school, and I could pass on one more. Wait, her name is Paige Down? Okay, now I have to play it. Though I'd hardly call the unreleased games we've looked at so far banned, there was definitely one country where some Pokemon games truly were banned from release. Due to the political history between Japan and South Korea, Japanese cultural imports such as manga, anime, video games, and music were completely banned for release in South Korea by the government since the end of World War II. This ban was in effect during the entire duration of the first generation of Pokemon games, and was only partially lifted in 1998. Gold and Silver saw a Korean release, but only on the Mini Comboy, a Game Boy-like system manufactured by Hyundai, and could not be played on official Nintendo systems. Between this product ban and the difficulty localization teams had fitting the Korean alphabet on the limited memory cartridge games had back then, Pokemon wouldn't see a Korean release again until 2004, when the South Korean government completely lifted its ban on Japanese cultural imports. This means Korea would never get any of the first-gen games, Pokemon Crystal, or any of the third-gen games, not to mention any of the spin-offs that were released during that time. However, with the release of the Nintendo DS, more and more Pokemon titles are making their way to South Korea, like the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon series, Diamond, Pearl and Platinum, Black and White 2, and even some spin-off games like Pokemon Dash and Trozei. These days, Pokemon is enjoying a considerable success in South Korea, and their translations and localizations tend to be closer to the original Japanese games than the ones we get. Pokemon is a truly beloved franchise around the world, and so far Nintendo has done a pretty good job of making sure everybody gets to play a fully translated and localized version of every game. As the games keep coming out at a faster and faster pace, though, I'm willing to bet that more and more games will get lost in translation and never make their way around the world. We'll have to wait and see, though, and keep our fingers crossed that Nintendo will keep delivering the goods. Thank you for watching, and if you want to see the Jay Woods review Pokemon Coliseum, head on over to my channel for the video. He'll be back to catch you next time, though, for another Poke Fact of the Day.